Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Dolores Best. I own Book No Further in downtown Roanoke with my husband, Craig Coker. We are an independent bookstore, and one of the things that we really like to focus on is our local authors because we have so many good ones. And we have two of them here tonight. We'll be talking with Ed Falco from Virginia Tech, who's going to be chatting with Kristina. I didn't look up the pronunciation 2 seconds ago. Trinova, is that right? Gorcheva-Newberry. Gorcheva. Okay, well, I apologize. I had it sitting right here, but I'm sorry. Anyway, we'll go ahead and start. I do want to tell you that anybody has questions during that, please put those here in the chat function. And as we get toward the end, we'll be asking some questions. We'll start off here with Ed Falco. For those of you who don't know, he is a professor at Virginia Tech and teaches writing in the MFA program. And he is a well-published author himself. Has published several novels and has one coming out in the spring. And what is the title of that, Ed?
Transcendent Gardening, a novel, not a gardening book.
And it is not a gardening book. We've clarified that, okay? So I will turn it over to Ed, and we will go from there. And again, just put your questions in the chat function, and we will get to those toward the end. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to hearing Kristina read. I've known Kristina since she was an MFA student at Hollins, and I've been watching her publish stories in good magazines and watching her get more and more recognition. Until now, she's got 2 books coming out in close proximity to each other, and I'm really very happy for her. It couldn't be a more deserving writer. Her stories have been published in Zoetrope New Story and Southern Review and Nimrod and lots of other really good literary journals, Triquarterly, other places. And she's her first language. This is a thing that I find amazing. Her first language is Russian, and she writes just gorgeously in English. So I think the first question I'm going to ask her is, "What's that like? How do you do that?" And I teach students all day whose first language is English, and they're still struggling with it. She came here in 1995, and she moves back and forth, I think, between New York, Russia, and here in Virginia. She's won the Katherine Anne Porter Prize for fiction, the Shumaker Prize from Prairie Schooner Books, which is the press that publishes a story collection, What Isn't Remembered. She's been a fellow or a scholar at Swanee, and she's just a really nice person. And I'm looking forward, as I said, to hearing her read and to chatting with her a little bit. So, are you going to read first, Kristina?
Yes, I will read first. I just want to say a few things, that this event is very special because it takes place in Roanoke, Virginia. And Virginia is where my immigrant journey started 26 years ago. It is also the state and the place where I was born as a writer. And I started writing as a graduate student at Radford University, where I was fortunate enough to have professors who pointed out to me that I have a story to tell and I could tell it well. But also it is there that I was introduced to the works of Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison. I have to thank Moira Baker for that. She was my professor. And I don't think this book could have happened had I not been introduced to those phenomenal women writers, and also Alice Munro. And I chose epigraphs from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse and also Alice Munro. So also, when I graduated from Radford with a MA in English, I went to Holland's University and got my MFA. And some of the stories in the collection were written while I was still a student at Holland's. So, and we lived in Roanoke for about almost 8 years. So Virginia and of course Roanoke hold many dear memories. And that's why this reading is very important to me. And also it's a double treat for me because I get to do a conversation with Ed Falco, and I met Ed 15 years ago, I believe at AWP. And since I met him, I wanted to do an event with him. So today I have a chance to do that. But before we chat, I will read a few pages from Boys on the Moscow River. It opens a collection. It's also the story that won the Katherine Anne Porter Prize. And it's also the story that deals with perestroika and all the chaos the Soviet people, now Russian people, went through. And of course, where crime, corruption, and ordered killings escalated. So here's Boys on the Moscow River. When my brother died in the winter of 1998, the snow fell all night and all day and all the following week, so they didn't find him right away. The contour of his body barely delineated, but otherwise indistinguishable from the shrouded, ice-etched forms. Out the window of my brother's luxurious apartment, the Moscow River appeared frozen, layered and white as though bandaged with strips of gauze. But if you stared at it long enough, if you let your eyes adjust to the ossifying whiteness all around, you could see the river tremble and shift underneath the snow, wet and sunken and hollow in the middle, like a puncture wound. We need to find your father, my mother said, filling her cup with more coffee. He can help carry the casket. You need to eat something, Mom, I said, turning away from the window that still held the misty imprint of my hand. Really, you don't sleep, you don't eat, you'll get sick. She peered into her coffee, her forehead strained with wrinkles, eyes squinting hard as though she were trying to read her fortune in the impervious wetness of the cup. Our father left us 2 months before my birth. He didn't find another woman, and he didn't hate our mother or his 2-year-old son, who was always sick and crying and not sleeping. But our father wanted to be free, free like birds. If he had wings, he told my mother, he would fly away, but he had legs, and so he walked and didn't come back. His fate. Somewhere in the old phone book, there should be his parents' number and address. Perhaps he's still there, my mother said. What will I say to him? Your older son is dead, and even though you haven't seen him for 26 years, asshole, we need you to be a pallbearer? And what about me, Mom? Technically, he's my father too. She didn't respond, her face buried in her hands. She wasn't old, although right there and then she could have been a grandmother, dressed in a stretched dark brown sweater with her gray hair swept behind her ears, frail, sunless skin, shoulders weighed low from the years of servitude to her parents, to us, to my brother. It isn't about you, Lyowa, she breathed out the words. It's never about me, but always about him. Tell you what, Mom, he didn't care about us. He preferred the city, the streets, it was just like our father. Again, she didn't respond. Her eyes flurries, spinning.
Keeps running a circle.
Somewhere in the yard, there was my brother's shoe, buried under a heap of snow. The year is 1980. I'm 8, and my brother Constantine is 10. It's one of the hottest summers we've had. There's no rain and there's no wind.
No, the functions were.
A blazing vessel of ceaseless heat. The air is dry and brittle. It tingles on your lips. Every living thing, every bug, every leaf pines for rain. The grass sighs and turns to dust. The flowers shrivel by mid-morning. The trees offer little shade and no reprieve. They don't move or sway their branches or rustle their leaves, but stand still as though painted on a piece of paper. The colors waver and melt away. We're swimming in the Moscow River, my brother and I, and he teaches me how to float on my back. Dragonflies dapple the surface, pinpricks of golden light. And for a moment, Constantine disappears. I am left alone, drifting softly, limbs akimbo. I feel his arms wrap around my chest and yank me underwater so quickly, the sun shrinks to the size of a fist, and then all is dark and murky, a pillar of silt rising from the bottom. I hold my breath for as long as I can until Constantine lets go, and I push for the water, climbing high and higher, guided by the trembling rings of light. Fight for your life, little brother, he says as soon as I shoot out, because no one else will. I flounder and suck the air and paddle ashore with all my strength. Our mother is home doing laundry or frying fish. She doesn't know we've gone to the river or that I've almost drowned. She worries about Constantine being too thin, squirming like a worm out of her loving arms. I am too heavy for my age, thick and sturdy, a stump of a boy. On the day of the funeral, the cemetery was a giant cocoon of snow, with monuments poking out here and there and tall three-barred crosses. From afar, they resembled crippled frozen birds caught mid-flight. The gaunt trees stood crystallized white. The limbs gave an impression of being broken and soldered to the trunks at odd angles. It was impossible to detect where snow ended and clouds began, all fused together, the sky and the earth and the thin whitish air like a muslin cloth suspended on trees and threaded through our fingers. The four of us agreed to be pallbearers, me, our neighbor, and two of Constantine's friends. The casket felt heavy, heavier than I'd expected, as though the snow too had added to the weight of Constantine's body. My father didn't wish to attend the funeral or speak to my mother, and he didn't call me by name during our short conversation. Just before hanging up, he said, "Your brother, was he mean to you? You two must have gotten into a lot of fights." "Some," I had replied, "some fights." The grave wasn't long enough, and we waited, shivering but otherwise not moving, as the gravediggers hacked and chopped away. The sounds of their shovels and pickaxes shook the damp earth and my mother's shoulders. Every now and then, I would glance at her stooping in that bulky sheepskin coat Constantine had bought for her last year. The coat seemed 2 sizes too big, or she 2 sizes too small, wilted inside its dyed black fur so that only the tips of her ungloved fingers were left visible, and her face, like a frostbitten apple, dark and lonely. Once she had seemed tall and proud to us, indomitable, with a broad, sturdy back, eager to support our weight and carry us into the future. But with years, as we thrived, she withered, as though she'd given us not only her energy and her labor, but her skin, her hair, her blood, all her vital powers. We were like vampires who couldn't control their urges, seduced by the sight and smell of such tender, familiar flesh, and who kept gorging on her life to sustain their own. My mother had decided not to cremate the body and not to open the casket, even though Constantine's face wasn't mangled. The first bullet had entered his heart, and the second, the back of his head, becoming trapped, permanently lodged inside his brain. For years afterward, I would dream about it. Him sauntering down the street, whistling a Beatles song, All the Lonely People or Yellow Submarine, shooting spit between his teeth and raising the collar of his leather coat, like an American movie gangster, like someone for whom death meant no more than a change of scenery or a new costume. I imagined the hitman too, screwing a silencer onto his gun, loitering behind the building, aiming the gun first at the distant sprawl of trees, then at my brother's back, then at his head, his broom bristle hair always cropped so short. Occasionally in my dreams, it would be me trudging toward Constantine's apartment complex, awaiting the bullet to enter my skull and tear into the cerebral cortex. And I would feel it tunnel through the lobes, occipital, parietal, frontal, temporal, nestling into my thalamus, or even not sinking that deep, segueing into the furrow between the two hemispheres. I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, cradling the back of my head, expecting to find the bullet hole, the raw, ugly edges of the wound. The year is 1984. the last winter before perestroika. We're 12 and 14, and we're shopping for groceries, milk, eggs, beef cutlets, rolled in breadcrumbs that crunch between our teeth after our mother has fried them in butter, or rather sunflower oil, but we don't know it then because everything tastes like butter, rich, delicious. The grocery store is invaded by people who scour the half-empty aisles, foraging for food, plucking off the shelves anything they can spot, be it a pack of soup bones, gamey meat, or sprouted purple-eyed potatoes. We've been warned that the country's supply of flour will peter out in less than a month. But as boys, we don't really know how long a month is, how short. Constantine strays off and hopes to procure beef cutlets while I'm ordered to guard 2 bottles of milk, a bag of millet, a can of herring, and half a loaf of black bread. It's been a while since Constantine has left and my arms begin to tingle from heat. I untie my ear flaps and take my rabbit hat off. My hair is wet, sticking to my scalp. Herds of people jostle by, but Constantine isn't among them, and I begin to panic. A lump of fear swells in my stomach. I abandon the toad on the floor just for a minute, I think, and scuttle toward the meat department. My brother isn't there, but a few older women haggling over pig feet to boil for holidays. It suddenly occurs to me that perhaps Constantine has already gone home, and I wade through the crowd, pushing between the heavy doors, swallowing snow. I'm almost back to our dingy, graffiti-scarred apartment building when I hear him whistle behind my back. Hey, he says, dickhead, where are you going? And where are all the groceries? Where's the bag? I halt, my heart nudged tight between my ribs, and I think about my mother reaching into the chicken's cavity that morning and yanking out the slimy, pebble-shaped organ, then rinsing it in cold water and frying it in oil. Quit being such a baby, Constantine says. Stop the fuck crying and wipe that snot. Disgusting. He's tall and wiry with a mean cleft in his chin. He's already begun to shave, and not because he has hair, but because he wants it to grow faster. You disappeared, I say, sniffling, shielding my face with my sleeve. You left me for an hour. I said I was coming back, and I did, didn't I? He pulls a chikushka of vodka out of his pocket and unscrews the lid, takes a long, hard swig. It's the first time I see him doing something forbidden, something adult. In a crowd of friends and family, I noticed a young woman with a little boy, 3 or 4 at most, bundled up in a down coat and with a red scarf noosing his neck and mouth. He fidgeted with the scarf, pushing it down, but the mother pulled it back up, making sure the boy's face stayed swaddled at all times. The young woman kept her eyes on the casket, while the red scarf boy rolled a snowball between his tiny gloved hands. Both the mother and the child stood closer to the trees and to the grave and appeared separate from the rest of the mourners. After the burial, she didn't follow the crowd toward the gates, but moved behind the thickest of trees until all I could discern was a small patch of red flashing in the distance, like a bullfinch or some other scarlet-breasted bird. Weeks would pass before I would see them again, weeks filled with silence, more snow, and months of tedious paperwork concerning the inheritance. My father had contacted us a few times, insisting on his share, but we ignored his impertinent demands. Soon, Constantine's bank account became privy to us, and also his ritzy apartment where my mother and I relocated. She wanted to be as close to her son in death as she couldn't be in life. She moved about the 5 richly furnished rooms of his home silently like a ghost, fading into the forms and shapes of his life, the pearl inlaid tables and curvy velour couches and solid oak bookcases with shelves upon shelves of American movies. The Godfather, Goodfellas, Princess-Honor, Once Upon a Time in America, The Terminator, Die Hard. My mother sat in her son's soft cherry suede chairs and lay in his field-wide bed, refusing to strip off his sheets. She fingered his clothes, jeans and cashmere sweaters and expensive leather jackets, and lingered by the tall velvet-draped windows, her quiet presence often unnoticed, yet somehow palpable, like a sudden breath of warm air on the nape of your neck. I bought groceries and cooked most mornings before work, but she would forget to eat it, forget there was life after life, hers after Constantine's. She became so thin, threadbare, you could see through her. could see her heart pulsing slower and slower, enmeshed in silence and grief. I had her all to myself now, and yet she was slipping away, dissipating into the darkness. As for me, I enjoyed living in my brother's apartment. I put on his flamboyant, if a bit arrogant lifestyle, like an ill-fitted glove of oiled, supple leather. It stretched with wear and gave a nice shape to your hand. I could now continue my education as opposed to managing a small food and liquor kiosk for the rest of my life and enjoy the view of the city and the Musk River while eating my meals, gazing dreamily out of the snow-brushed window. There was darkness out there and there was light, the city coiled patched with shadows. The outside world was like the river itself, treacherous and invisible, protected by snow that would soon melt, exposing deep cracks in the eyes, through which the water would try to escape, gain a semblance of freedom. When the doorbell rang, I was loading the dishwasher and my mother had dozed off in Konstantin's desk chair, a picture album hugged against her belly. I recognized the woman and the boy from the cemetery and felt obliged to ask them in, nodding and stooping awkwardly as though I were the one who had appeared on their doorstep with a stern, urgent gaze and a clump of snow underfoot. The young woman had a smooth face, small, inconspicuous features, except maybe for the mouth, too broad, too pulpy, intimidating. She said nothing while she undressed the boy, hanging his red scarf and coat on the hall tree. Squatting, she pulled off his boots one by one before producing a pair of fuzzy slippers from the backpack. She fitted them on his feet, set the boots next to mine by the door, then got up and squeezed the boy in her arms, his sweet, scared face nuzzled into her fur coat. "He's your nephew," she said, and pushed the little guy toward me with such a force he bumped against my hip. "What do you mean he's my nephew? Who are you?" "Unimportant, but you must take care of him because I can't, not at the moment." "No way, you fucking kidding me?" With her sad, dark eyes, she studied my sweater, or rather Konstantin's, gray with purple stripes. It was a little too snug yet long in the sleeves, but I loved how soft it felt against my chapped winter skin. "I bought it for him," she finally said. "Well, that doesn't prove squat, no? Konstantin hated children, compared them to asshole hairs, dirty and annoying." "I really must go, but I'll be back, I promise." "When?" She shrugged. "Soon. Be good to him. He'll eat anything, and he is stranger friendly." She opened the door and walked out, scurried down the steps with dull thuds. I stared at the puddle of water on the floor and then at the boy. He didn't move, half leaning against me, his kitten gray eyes brimming with tears. "Shit," I said. "Shit," he echoed. Thank you.
That was terrific, Kristina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Language in your stories is so beautiful. The writing is so lyrical and yet so strongly narrative at the same time, which makes it both delicious to read and unable to put down, which is a great feat for a writer. But before we start talking about the stories, could you tell us a little bit about your journey from Russia to the U.S., what brought you here, and how it's influenced your writing, that as a writer whose first language is Russian and who writes in English?
Yes, I came here in 1995, and it is a very long story. I'm actually writing a little episode, hopefully, for Modern Love series in New York Times. When I met my husband, my future husband, fell in love and stayed here. So if it hadn't been for him, I probably wouldn't have come here. And well, I certainly wouldn't have learned to speak English with a Southern accent. So that's how I came here. And writing in a foreign language, so I never wrote anything in Russian. So I began writing in English, but I did study English from the age of 8. My mother took me to special English school. And I often tell the story. When I came back from having my first English lesson, I told my mother, I said, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. And she said, what? I said, English. And she said, well, that's not a profession. You know, that's a language. She said, well, maybe you can be a teacher. And the thing is, later on, you know, when I asked her, you know, why couldn't you said writer? And she said, what are you talking about? You know, back then we were all trying to survive. I mean, nobody thought about arts or writing. And of course, you know, also back then, we're talking, you know, late 70s, early 80s. In the Soviet Union, women didn't write much. I mean, poetry, yes, an occasional screenplay, maybe a detective story, but no novels. Those were, you know, those belonged to men. And most of the men were long dead. So now, of course, we have many wonderful, strong fiction writers, but not back then. So that's how my journey started. Of course, you know, when I was 8, I could have never thought that English or writing would become my vocation, just as I could have never thought that America would become my second home.
And so you don't write in Russian at all, though, right?
No.
What about the great Russian short story writers like Chekhov, Gogol, Maupassant? Are they not Maupassant, Tolstoy? Are those influences for you?
Yes. Well, as you know, in growing up, we all studied them. We had to read them, and sometimes here, you know, we would hear people say, "Oh, it'll take a lifetime to read War and Peace." And I think, wasn't it Mark Twain who said, the only thing Tolstoy neglected to include in War and Peace as a boat race. Everything else is there. So, believe it or not, we had to read those magnificent authors. Like War and Peace was assigned as a summer reading, and then you had a month, you know, to discuss it. So Chekhov, yes, of course, we read Gogol and Chekhov and Turgenev and Bunin and Dostoevsky. Although recently, I'm reading Nabokov's lectures on Russian literature. Mm-hmm. I think he wrote them in 1940 and 1941 and delivered them at Cornell. And I just learned that Dostoevsky is a very bad writer. So, and
he thought Crime and Punishment was a terrible book.
Exactly. And it's interesting to me to reread those authors, as I frequently do. I reread Chekhov all the time, and I read Turgenev and Tolstoy. It's interesting to read them now from the point of view of a writer, you know, not a Soviet citizen or, you know, Russian-speaking person, but from a point of view of a writer, and see how much influence they did have on my work, especially Chekhov, because, you know, my novel that's coming out in March is loosely based on The Cherry Orchard.
Oh, interesting. Playwright as well as a great short story writer.
Right.
Back to the story you just read, Boys on the Moskva River. What's the genesis of that? Where does that come from for you?
Well, I did live in Moscow during Perestroika and after, as I came here, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was in 1991. So I lived through all those emotions and all those events. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the rise of the Iron Curtain, and also, of course, crime, escalated, the two putschs, 1991, 1993. That particular story, all of my stories, and people who know me know that all of my stories grow out of feelings. You know, I would have a feeling something, and I would need to build a house to put the feeling in it. That particular story also also grew out of a feeling, but it also was inspired by some tragic events. I was already living in Virginia, and I had a very good friend who, I've known him back then. I've known him maybe 10 years or 12 years. Anyway, it was his birthday, and I always called him on his birthday, and he always called me on my birthday. And I remember it was fall. I was sitting on the porch in my home in Bland, Virginia, and I dialed his number, and someone else picked up. And he always picked up his phone, especially on his birthday. So once that happened, I knew that something tragic had occurred. And I also knew that it's something that I wouldn't be able to process immediately, that it will affect me long-term, and that it was irrevocable. And that feeling of total powerlessness, hurt, that feeling stayed with me. So when I found out that indeed my friend was killed execution style, he was killed in his new apartment. He was shot in the chest and in the head. The murder was never solved. So, but the void his absence had created, that feeling of something lost forever, that feeling never left me. When I think of him, that's the feeling that I have. So I had to write a story to put that feeling in. And so everything is fictional in that story, except for that event, that Konstantin is killed execution style, just like my friend was. And so that's the background of the story.
Yeah, and you make it to be about Russia. There's so much wonderful detail in there about the culture and about the time. You sort of recreate a moment in history, Right. So it's got a little touch of noir in it, but it's a magnificent, just a magnificent story. Let's switch over to another story. What the title story? What isn't remembered? Throughout, moving all the way throughout the stories are art and culture, music especially, and they seem to be vehicles for you to explore life and love. And there just feels like a kind of passionate connection to the arts, and certainly in what isn't remembered, there are paragraphs that could be sort of lessons on the nature of music and the nature of art. But talk a little bit about your love of art and culture and how it works its way into your stories.
That's an excellent question, and thank you, Ed, for asking that. Well, I think also it goes back to being raised in the Soviet Union, where arts, despite all the ugliness, arts played a major role. And my mother, I have to thank my mother for that. My mother spent all of her money on books, theater, philharmonic. So I always went to concerts, and I always saw plays and listened to operas. But I think my love for music, of course, became stronger after my son was born. And my son, he's a musician, he plays classical and jazz. So over the years, my husband and I, we drove him to lessons and recitals, festivals, everything, really. So it's hard even to to say how much music and how much I've learned from him about music. And it is a great privilege to share that landscape with your child, so this artistic landscape. So I think, and a lot of those stories were written with him practicing in another room. So inevitably, music kind of slipped into the collection. But I think the more I wrote, the more I realized how any art form doesn't exist in isolation, that one art form informs another and another and another, and especially music. And the title story also has a story behind it. My son participated in music festival in Cremona, so that festival is real, that's described in the story. And my husband and I spent 2 weeks in Cremona there with him. It was wonderful. It was 5 years ago, 5 years ago. And so it was there in Cremona that I heard for the first time Rachmaninoff's cello sonata. And when I heard that sonata, it is so gorgeous. It's just voluptuous. It's hard to describe, but it affected me so much that for days I walked in that sound. I had to find recordings. I listened to it. So I had to do something with it. And also at the time I was reading Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And those two things, as it often happens in life and in art, those two things sort of assimilated and then converged in What Isn't Remembered. It is also an allusion to Alice Munro's What Is Remembered, one of my absolute favorite stories. So that's why I also titled the collection What Isn't Remembered. So in the story, Mana, when she reads Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, the last scene is described in my story, What Isn't Remembered. It's Lily Briscoe finally finishes her painting. And what she does, she paints a line in the middle of the canvas, which Mana interprets as her life before and after. So before she met the Ramses and after, when, some of the Ramses were already gone. Also at Mana's life before she met Tori and after. And I also think of my life that way too. Before I came to America and after. Before I started writing and after. So that story is very important to the collection. And that's why I also picked the epigraph from To the Lighthouse. And also from Alice Munro's To Much Happiness. Because in that title story, the two women, two magnificent writers, geniuses, whose work I revere, they're both present in that story.
So I like the, thank you for explaining the illusions in What Isn't Remembered, but beyond that, what isn't remembered, how does that work? I mean, how does that work in your collection? What is it we're not remembering?
Well, I think that sometimes some little details or things we don't want to remember, right? That render our experiences different than what we would like them to be, which is what happens in the story, because only at the very end, Mana remembers that particular gesture. Because through her whole story, she's not aware, she thinks, did it really happen or did it not? Did she imagine a lot of those things? But and the reason why she couldn't be quite sure is that she pushed those little details somewhere really deep inside her mind, and she wouldn't remember them. But then at the end, she remembers that detail, which sets everything, clear for her. Meaning that one afternoon in a hotel room with Tori, how it changed Mana's life and what it what it was for Mana and what it wasn't for Tori, that one little detail. And I think that a lot of our life, our lives are like that. We remember events, but then there might be one detail, one peculiar accident that we sort of, put away and we don't remember it until something happens or we're willing to re-examine that particular episode or how it affected our lives. And if we are willing to re-examine it, then what isn't remembered becomes remembered. And then I think we grow as human beings from that, from re-examining our life. We can't change how things happen because they've already happened, but we can re-examine our attitude at the time, right? And we can grow from that. I also, in that particular story, but in other stories too, how, so time is a very, I'm fascinated with time. That story manipulates time in many ways, how it starts seemingly here in the present tense, but then it goes all over the place. And so I once took a Native American class in Radford, actually, and the concept of time in Native American culture is that it exists simultaneously, as though in a circle. There's past and there is present and there's future, but it's all together. Now, we're living in a linear culture, so for us, there is past and there is present and there is future. However, fiction, our stories, perhaps it's the only way where we can exist simultaneously in the past, in the present, and in the future. And that's what that story does. And there's reference to that clock that has no numbers, and how Tori says, well, maybe, it's time is eternity, something is supposed to represent eternity, like those structures, ancient structures, then, why, time is irrelevant. So that's how I think of fiction writing in general and of stories. It's where, books are bridges. They're bridges not only, into different centuries, right? Into different times, but they're also bridges into different cultures, and they're bridges into readers' hearts. So, but we can, time becomes captured, where in real life, no, it goes by, just as we talk right now, it goes by. So.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about stories, is that they are more meditative than the other art forms. You can stop and think and go back and move around in them. I'm curious, that was such a lucid discussion of what's going on in the story. How much of that do you go into a story with, and how much do you discover along the way?
Well, all stories are very different, and some stories, they are almost fully formed. They come to me almost fully formed. Others, no. I have to work hard, and sometimes with that story, it's a peculiar story because 5 years ago I started writing it while in Cremona after I heard Rachmaninoff's sonata. But when I didn't have time to finish it, so I wrote maybe 5 pages or 6 pages. And then something, we came back and something happened with my computer. I switched computers. I couldn't find that story. So I thought, I lost it. And 3 years passed and we went to Prague, and I was actually working on a novel. And in my suitcase, I found the flash drive, and I said, what is that? So I plugged it in, and that story was on it. But it was 3 years later. So I only had like 6 pages, and I said, okay, well, what would I do with that story? And you know what? One afternoon I sat down and I finished it. I wrote in one afternoon the rest of the 9 pages. So here's this almost 4 years between I started it and when I finished it. And can I encounter all that had happened in those 4 years? No. But the feeling I had when I started it goaded me when I finished it 4 years later, and it's still there. So when I reread that story, that feeling that Lily Briscoe had painting the canvas, that feeling that Mana had that afternoon, that feeling that I had after I listened to that Rachmaninoff sonata performed in the Teatro Fele Dramatici, it's there. It is trapped between the lines of that story. And I'm so happy that I titled the collection after that story.
That's nice. On a more, here's just a more kind of writer question. You've been working many years and publishing, stories in good journals and working on your writing. And then suddenly you have 2 books taken and they're coming out with months of each other. What does that feel like as a writer? I mean, what's your emotional kind of response to that?
Well, emotion we can just be like this, but it really is a miracle. And I grew up in a world that was somewhat morbid. It was sealed off, but in that world, most Russian or Soviet people that I know, including my mother, all believed in miracles. Because, if you don't believe in miracles, I have no hope, life is unbearable, right? So when that happened, I had 2 books coming out almost at once. That's what it was. And it's just a miracle. And my mother said, see, I told you so. So that's how I feel about it. It's a miracle. And I don't try to rationalize. I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate I came to this country. I'm fortunate that someone, or rather not someone, Dr. Baker, if she's here, pointed out to me that I should start writing. I'm fortunate that I had wonderful teachers, both at Radford and at Hollins, that I've met wonderful writers along the way who encouraged me. And, when I would say, but, I write in a foreign language, how can I compete with native speakers? And they would say, Conrad did it, Nabokov did it, a lot of people did it, you could do it. So I'm just fortunate, and that's how I take it. I got lucky, and it's a miracle. I have 2 books coming at once.
Yeah. Those miracles seem to happen more often to really good writers. Talk a little bit about your years in the MFA program at Hollins and who the writers were that encouraged and influenced you.
So writers in general who influence my writing, other than the great Russians, of course, are 3 writers. There are in acknowledgements. There are 3 literary goddesses: Toni Morrison, Virginia Woolf, and Alice Munro. So I'm indebted to those writers. I've never read them while in Russia. And so, in fact, after I read The Bluest Eye, that's when I thought that I would love to become a writer. Whether I could or not, I didn't know, but that's when it happened, when I read The Bluest Eye, and Morrison's work affected me. And to this day, most people who know me, I talk about Morrison all the time. Any chance, again, I talk about Morrison. So I was, and that happened at Radford, actually, where I was getting my MA in English, where I started writing and where I took my first creative writing class. Then I went to Hollins. So I am grateful to Hollins first day, well, I got scholarship and fellowship to teach. So I taught there for a year, and I absolutely loved that experience. Also, it was in one of the tutorials. Richard Dillard was the head of that tutorial, where I wrote a story that's in the collection, Champions of the World. And that story is at the heart of my novel, The Orchard. When I wrote Champions of the World, it was 36 pages long, and tutorials were small. There were 4 or 5 people. Most people liked the story well, but Richard, I remember him saying, that story has a voice, a certain distinct voice. You need to follow that voice, and that's what I did. I followed the voice. So I'm grateful to Richard just pointing it out to me. It was so long, I didn't even think the story would get published, but it did get published in the Southern Review. As far as MFAs go, well, I think it's a good place to build your literary community. And I think it's a good place to learn from established writers like yourself, because you teach. And I remember when I think it was before I met you, when I first read your work, and I was just amazed at what you could do in a short story. And I remember that, I think it was Rick Treffaway who, I think we got acquainted through Rick Treffaway, and he told me that, if you could take a class with Ed, you should take a class with Ed. So I do believe that MFAs are good in the sense that you can hone your craft. You can find other writers who believe in your work, and you can deepen your understanding of the craft. Now, can an MFA program manufacture a successful writer? I don't think so, because I don't think that a talent can be manufactured. I don't think you can teach someone to imagine. So the gift of imagining or telling a story should be there, but how to tell that story better can be taught at the MFA. And I learned enormously while I was at Hollins, enormously. Conflict, character, scenes, just everything. And I will communicate with a few writers who came out of the program. In fact, Jen Fox has 2 books coming out. Also, she had 1 book coming out, and 1 is coming out, I think, in a month. She's also a wonderful short story writer.
Yeah, well, Holland seems to do something right. They keep producing terrific writers out of that program. Do you think you'll teach yourself, Kristina?
Sorry?
Do you think you want to teach yourself?
Yes, I taught for a few years. I taught a year at Roanoke College and at Hollins, and then I worked at VMI for a few years. I love teaching. Now I have more time because my son has all grown up, graduated. I don't have to drive him to concerts and recitals. He can drive himself. And yes, I do. I love teaching. And most of all, I would love to give back to the literary community or to aspiring writers what had been given to me while I was a student. Because I believe that you need to share your knowledge. You need to share what you learn. That's how we grow as people, but that's also how we grow as writers. Transcendence. I think that it's very important to share your knowledge. I think we're better people for that. You can't hold knowledge hostage. You have to share.
And for you, what are the rewards of being a writer? I mean, I'm teaching undergraduates this semester, and they want to be famous. They want to make a lot of money. They want to be celebrities. All of things which are not going to happen for them, but that's what they want. But you've been a serious writer for a long time. What are the great rewards of being a writer? The real rewards for you of being a writer?
No, my mother always told me that anything important in life, it doesn't come immediately. And you have to work hard. If it's something important and it's worth it, you have to work hard. So working hard has never been a problem for me. And I knew that to begin with. You know, I write in a foreign language. Of course, I work hard. I have to memorize words, pages and pages of words. I have to look up, you know, their meanings, their multiple meanings. So reward, you know, also, my mother once told me, if you write a story and one person reads it and comes back to you and says, you know, you touched my heart, that's all that matters. So again, you know, writers build bridges. So I hope to build a bridge. I hope to connect our countries. I hope to connect our cultures. I hope to expose more people to how life was in the former Soviet Union and maybe even now. And I hope for my Russian readers to know more about this side of the world. So as a writer, for me, the biggest reward is to build that bridge. Because, I mean, how can we heal all the animosity and how can we understand one another if it hadn't been for arts? You know, to me, arts, and especially language, you know, that's what we have that sets us apart from, you know, the animal world, but also that helps us connect to one another. So that's my biggest reward. If I can build a teeniest bridge, you know, maybe only 100 people would walk across that bridge, but that's already enough for me.
Just one more question, then maybe some folks in the audience might have a question they want to put in the chat to ask you. But in the process of writing, do you find that you learn stuff about yourself and your culture? Or do you go into it pretty much knowing what it is you want to say?
No. The element of surprise, someone asked me for one of the interviews about the endings. And do you know how the story ends? You know, how you approach the ending. And, you know, Katherine Anne Porter, she once said in one of her lectures that until you know the end, there's no story. Because a writer, an artist, doesn't deal with the acts or events, but the consequences of those acts or events. In other words, it might take years to understand what happened and how it happened. I am not like that. Occasionally I would know how the story ends, or loosely know, but most of the time I have to have that surprise. So no, I go into the story willing to learn and willing to be surprised and also discover. So I don't, like Morrison said, she said she wrote books she wanted to read. So I write stories I want to read, but also I think I learn, I think I'm a better person. I'm a better mother, I'm a better wife, I'm a better friend, because writing those stories, well, first of all, any writer knows that it teaches you patience, great patience. And we need patience, especially now, and especially during the pandemic. And also, I learn how, you know, I analyze. You know, we study human condition as writers. We analyze human behavior. So a lot of times I analyze myself. And sometimes I think that's pretty, you know. Sometimes I discover things that, you know, I probably would have not discovered otherwise. And some of those things are not all that beautiful. But I'm willing to do that. I think writing, it's about, you're just say vivisecting your own heart, So we perform surgeries, right? As fiction writers every day.
The human heart in conflict with itself.
Right, Faulkner, right?
Faulkner, yeah. Thank you, Kristina. I'm wondering if anybody in the audience, anybody who's here has a question for Kristina that you could put in the chat, because I don't want to exclude your audience. And if not, Kristina, Stephen Klein Davis asks, what's next?
Well, I have hi, Stephanie.
Stephanie, I'm sorry.
Yes, we met at Roanoke when I lived in Roanoke. Stephanie is a wonderful photographer. So I have a novel coming out in March, and I've just finished another novel. It's the working title is Sputnik Hotel. And all I will say that it grew out of one episode of my life when I was 16 years old. My father was staying at the Sputnik Hotel. My parents were divorced since I was 2. I've never seen my father but that one time, because my aunt worked at Sputnik Hotel and she saw him walking through the lobby. She called my mother, they dressed me up, and they sent me to Sputnik Hotel. And they just wanted to see if he would recognize me. And from that little episode, the entire fictional novel grew out, and I just finished it, and I have to let it rest and revise it before submitting it any further. And that's what's next, other than The Orchard. And The Orchard is finished. I just got ARC. So I'm looking forward to the novel.
That's exciting. Suede wants to know if you can talk about let me see if I can read this. Can you talk about when you're feeling the story turning and you've reached the end? Did I get that right, Suede? Can you talk about when you're feeling the story turning and you've reached the end?
Well, like I said, I like surprises, and sometimes I will be writing, and then it just ended. I just know it ended. They could be nothing else, even though maybe I've planned another ending, but then it ended. But I'm one of those writers who let stories rest after I finish them, and I would go back to them maybe 5 weeks later, maybe a month later, it could be 2 months. And if I read it again and that ending sticks, so I know it's the right ending, then it stays. But sometimes I have to rewrite it. Sometimes I have to rewrite the endings. Sometimes they just don't feel right to me. And I write by ear. And maybe that's why I love music so much. I can't sing, I can't play an instrument, but I write. And fiction writing is music as well. So I write by ear, and sometimes something just clicks, I hear it, it's ended, it ended. But then I have to analyze where all the parts, fit. Because, short stories don't have any, can't afford any gratuitous information. So I have to see where the ending aligns with the rest of the story. Sometimes I struggle, like the rest of us. Some things just don't come fully formed, and you have to wait and pause. And sometimes I ask my husband, and he can give me his opinion. An interesting thing, and it happened not long ago, I finished the story. It was supposed to be a part of a story within a story. Chekhov was famous for that. So it started with the writer giving a reading, and then the story that the writer was reading. But then it ended. I planned it to be a bookend structure where the writer started and the writer finished. But then I thought, well, no, it could be a story on its own. So I cut the beginning and I just left the middle. So I sent it to my, so and my husband thought it was, you didn't need the beginning. So when I sent it to my agent, she read it. Somehow she said, I don't know, it feels like it's a story within a bigger story. And I said, well, it was a part of the bigger story. So she read the beginning and she said, maybe you should finish it differently. So I had to sit on it and I waited and waited. And then I did finish it differently. And I did think that my first intention was correct, where it should be a story within a story. But when something didn't quite, it didn't quite end it for me. So once I revised it, I thought it became a better story. So endings are spur of a moment thing for most of the time, but occasionally it will be something that I will plan.
Thanks, Kristina. Lisa Kraslavska, forgive me if I'm not getting all the pronunciation right, but she writes, you are a writer who arrived 26 years ago and are representing a time period that is long gone, but is still alive in the hearts of so many Russians. How do you say this connects to a cross-cultural audience today?
Well, for that particular reason, that culture is still alive for so many people. And I also think that, again, writing, especially fiction writing, is a bridge into that other world. And without that bridge, the world today doesn't exist. So, because worlds don't exist in isolation, they're not, beautiful flower baskets that are hanging all over the place. Everything is connected. So I want for my books to become bridges, but also to open up dialogues between that generation of Soviet people and American people, and between a younger generation. There's so many things that we saw and witnessed in that other country that could be of help to this country, but also to a younger generation in Russia today. And in fact, my novel is dedicated to my generation, Generation Perestroika. That generation who in a single decade lived under Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and who in that one single decade had lost everything it had ever dreamed about. So it's very important for others to know about those years and about that generation and about that era. And I understand that, in a way, all our lives are narratives of loss. We're mortal. So we lose everything. We're destined to lose our mothers, fathers, and we lose lovers, spouses, friends, dreams, countries, in my case. But our stories don't have to be. They don't have to be narratives of loss.
That's, yeah. I don't think we have any more questions coming from the chat. Doris, did you have something?
Yeah, Ed, thanks so much. This was wonderful. And I love your reading. It's just your style of reading. It's very smooth. And I love it when an author reads their own work because it sounds the way that they intend it to sound. It was beautiful. Want to thank Ed, you as well, for leading the discussion here. I want to remind everybody that you can purchase a copy of the book on our website. If you follow the link that's in the chat, you'll see Ed's and Kristina's books. For the thing and the whole presentation, and we will have it up on our website shortly. It takes us a little bit to edit it because we're not editing professionals, but it'll be up in a week or so, and we will send out a link to you, or you can check out our YouTube channel. Everyone, thanks for coming tonight. We do appreciate your support, and come visit us in our store in downtown Roanoke. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dolores. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Ed.